Hello developers, welcome to day 10 of the 30 days of JavaScript challenge. Today presents another chance for us to engage with challenges and further enrich our understanding of JavaScript concepts. Let's dive in and make the most out of this learning journey. Today's challenge says, given a function fn, return a new function that is identical to the original function except that it ensures that fn is called at most once. The first time the returned function is called, it should return the same results as fn, and every subsequent time it is called, it should return undefined. And there are some examples here. The first example, the value of fn is a function that accepts three parameters a, b, and c and returns the sum of those arguments. And if it is called with the value 1, 2, and 3, it will return 6 because it's 1 plus 2 plus 3, that is 6. And when it is called with this other array 2, 3, and 6, it will return undefined because this function fn is supposed to run only once. The second example, fn is a function that accepts three parameters also and returns the product of those arguments. So if it is called with 5, 7, and 4, it will return the product of this 5, 7, and 4, that is 140. And if it is called with other extra arguments like this one, it will return undefined. And also to call the third time, it will return undefined because it's supposed to be called only once. And the constraints are, the first one specifies that the input call is a valid JSON string. The second constraint says that the number of function calls can be at least 1 and at most 10. The other constraints, the third one says that the number of items in the array should be between 1 and 100. And this last one says that the JSON string representing the calls array must have a minimum characters of 2 and a maximum character of 1000. So that is today's challenge. So let us learn something before you solve the challenge. To solve this challenge, you need to know these four concepts here. I know you've already learned them, but I believe by repetition, we learn even more. So I'll just repeat them in brief. So the first concept is closures. And we say that closures allows function to retain access to variables from their lexical scope. For example, let's say I have a variable, I'll call it outer variable. Let's say I have this outer variable here, outer variable. Let's say it has the value of 10. Then I have a function, I'll call it inner function, like that. So this function can have access to this outer function through the power of closures. For example, if I let me just return, I can return outer like that. So since this outer variable is outside the scope of this function, but this function can still have access to it. So if I log, let me just log this, let me call this function is called inner function, inner, then I call it like that. And if I run this code, it will return 10 because this inner function has access to this outer variable. And that is the simple definition of closures. You can see it says 10 here in the terminal. So the next concept is this one for truthy values. And we say that truthy values are those values that evaluate true when they are coerced into a boolean. And we saw how you can perform coercion in any data type to a boolean. And we say that to check if a value is true, you can use the if statement, this one. So if anything that is here, let me put a log truthy. If this code runs, it means that the value that you passed here is truthy. For example, it said that the common truthy values are like true. True is truthy. So if I pass here true and I run this code should display truthy because true is truthy. You can see it says truthy. But if I pass other falsy values like false, it won't execute because this false is not truthy, it's false. So you can see that if I run this code now, it will not display truthy because the value passed here is not truthy. The other way of checking, let me comment this. The other way of checking if a value is truthy, you can use this boolean function. It's like this, boolean. Then you pass the value there. For example, if I pass true, then I log this value to return true because this boolean function first converts this value here into a boolean. Then if it's truthy, it returns true, and if it's not truthy, it returns false. And that is how we check for truthy values. The next concept is this one for spread operator, and we said the spread operator looks like this, just 3 dots like that. And this spread operator allows an iterable to be expanded into individual elements. For example, if I have an array, let's say I have an array of numbers, I push some random numbers there like that. Should be a comma here. I think I missed this is equal sign here. So let's say I have a variable of numbers. Let me log the you can expand this array into individual elements using the spread operator. So if I spread these numbers here, then I log them and I run this code, each individual element will be displayed as, it will not be displayed as an array, it will display as each individual elements like this. You can see it's 3, 6, 7, and 8, but not as an array, as each individual element. And that is how the spread works. It converts an iterable like this array into individual elements. And that is what we said about the spread operator. The other thing is this rest, they're called rest parameters, not rest parameters. And they also use this same syntax of 3 dots. And we say that this rest parameter, they allow a function to accept an indefinite number of arguments as an array. It is useful when you want to write functions that can take any number of arguments. For example, if I have a function called sum, and I want this function to return the sum of any number passed, so I can spread the arguments like that. There should be 3 dots, not 2. And let's say let me call it using this numbers array. Let me log the results also. Log args like that. Then I want to call sum using the numbers array that I declared up here. And also let me just comment out this log so that the log should not be full of many logs. Then now let me log this sum. Now this, let me run this code first. Now this function can accept any number of arguments. You can see it's an array of an array because we passed in an array. So let's say, let me create you can see now this rest parameter converts a list into an array. For example, here if I don't call, let me just edit this code a little bit. If I call this sum with actual numbers, let me call it with actual numbers like 4, 7, and 8, like that. Then if I run this code again, let me move this log because I'm already logging it. Let me remove this other log here. So if I run this code, you can see these arguments will be passed here as an array. So it will be an array of 4, 6, and 7. Now you can pass any number of arguments here. And we saw that in detail. So to learn more about these concepts, you can watch the previous videos where we discussed them in details. But these are the concepts that we need to solve this challenge. Now that we have reminded ourselves of the concepts that we need, we can now solve the challenge. So this challenge you're supposed to accept a function and return a new function that is identical to the original function. So I'll just create a function. Const, let me call it once. And I'll use the anonymous function syntax like that. Yeah. So this function is supposed to accept a function fn. So I'll accept fn as a parameter there. Then I'm supposed to return a new function that is identical to the original. So here I'm supposed to return another function like that. So I'll also use anonymous function syntax. So this is a function that returns another function. So this is a high order function because it's a function returning another function. And you know that this function, if you call this function once, you will get a function. You not get a value, you get a function. So to get the actual value of the results of this inner function, you can either assign it to a variable, then call that variable, or you can immediately invoke this inner function. We already talked about that in the previous challenges. So let's just continue. So this other function should accept, given a function, return a new function that is identical to the original function, except that it ensures that fn is called at most once. So we want to just call fn here. So here we'll just call fn, but you want to ensure that this fn is called at most once. So let me just look at this example. The first time this return function is called, it should return the same results as fn, and every subsequent time it is called, it should return undefined. So this inner function has to take some parameters, and we don't know there how many. That's where the concept of rest parameters comes in. So you can just make this function flexible by accepting any number of parameters like that. So I'll just say this inner function can accept any number of parameters because you don't know how many there will be. So if you look at this example, like this inner example here, so let me just copy this. Let me copy this code and write it here so that you can use it as a reference. So I'll call this fn. Then I paste that. Oh, it's already fn, so I can just remove this. So you can just paste that code there. Then let us see how it will be. So this will be the inner function. So you can say this one accepts 3 parameters. That's why you're spreading here. You're using the rest parameters to accept any number of parameters that will be put. You don't know, maybe it will be 3, maybe 7, you don't know. So that's why you're using the spread. Then you want to call this function using these parameters that are passed. So you can call them using that like that. But if you do something like this, this will be an array, because I've already seen that if you use the rest parameters, these arguments will be an array. So if you call them to fn, you'll be calling fn with an array, and that might give you unexpected results. So before you call this, you have to spread them. So this is the spread operator. This one was the rest arguments. Then this one is the spread operator. We'll spread this array into individual elements and call them in this fn function like that. I hope that was not fast, it was clear, because I believe by now we already know these concepts. So yeah, it should be something like that. But this one will call, and you have to return this value, because if you don't return, it won't do anything. So you have to return this value. But if you do something like this, it will call this function as many times. But let us see how this will work first. So I have this value of fn here, and you know that this one will return a function. So you have to create a variable to store this function here. So I'll create a variable here. You can either create a variable or use the immediately invoked function expression, but I'll just use this variable. I'll call it once fn like that. Then I'll call this once. We know that, let me just explain slowly. If you call this once, if I call it with the function fn, it will return another function. So this function, it's either I do something like this, I call it again, or assign it to a variable. Like that's what I was doing. I was assigning it to a variable called like that. Then I call this variable down here. I call that variable. And we already talked about this. Is like, so you're treating this function as a variable. That is treating function as a first class citizen. So now you can call this, in this example one, we call this fn with 1, 2, 3. So I'll call it with 1, 2, and 3. So 1, 2, and 3 like that. So if I save this code and run it, it will give me 6. Let me just, I didn't log it, so let me just log these results. So I have to log these ones. So if I run this code again, let me put this terminal a little bit up. You can see it gives me 6. But the gotcha is that this code will still not work, because there's this time it says that you should call it only once. But if I call it twice, let's say I call it once, then I call it again with the different values like 2, 3, and I'm using this example 1, 2, 3, and 6. So 2, 3, and 6. Then I run this code. You can see it gives me 6 and 11. So this code calls this function every time. But the challenge expects that this function will be called only once. This one should return 6, and this one should return undefined. So you have to modify this code a little bit, but I was just showing you how this works first, because you have to understand how this works before you solve this challenge. Now here, this is a function called once that returns another, that accepts a function first, fn, as an argument, then it returns another function, and this inside function calls that outside function using the arguments called with it, like that. So that is what you have done. But grant now, before instead of calling it every time this outside function is called, this inside function is also called. But you want this inside function to be called only once. Even if this outside function is called 10 times, this inside function should only be called once. So you can write a condition. So you can use the closures. You can create a variable here. So I'll call this variable called. So I'll say let called is equals to false. So this is just like this is a member variable. It will act like as a flag to check if the function is called or not. So initially we write it as false to show that the function, when we start running the code, the function is not called. Then we can check here. You can say if this function is called, we want to return undefined. That is the question that I was saying. He said if it is not, if it's already called, we want to return undefined. Somewhere there you can see. So we'll return, it's here. If the subsequent time it is called, it should return undefined. So if it's called, we want to return undefined. And you know, at the start it is false, so this code will not execute because it is false. Then if it is not called, we want to return the result of this function, and also want to set this flag to true. So you can just set called to true. So yeah, so before I run this code, here you have a function called once that accepts another function fn, and it returns a function that calls that function. I know there's many functions, but I believe you just flow with it. So here I'm checking if the function is called. If it is called, return undefined. If it is not called, call it, then set this called variable to true. So if I run this code now, this one should return 6, then this one should return undefined. Because once this one is 6, you can see 6 and undefined. Because for the first time you're calling this once, it will pass this function here. Then it will take these arguments and spread them. Then since called will be false, it will run these other lines of code here. It will set call to true, then call that function. The second time you're calling the same function, the value of call will be true. Because you have said the power of closures, this state is maintained within this function. When you learned about closures, we talked about this outside variable state. Its state is maintained inside this function. So this call will be true. So when you call it second time, this code will run. So it will return undefined, and that is why this second call returned undefined. So yeah, that is the solution. So if you try this other example here, you can just copy it, paste it there. Then I can change. Let me just select. Then I comment this up variable. This up. I comment that. Then this one should be times, not x. Times. Then I want to call it with this one. I want to call it with 5, 4, and I'll call it with that here. Then I call it with this one the second time. 2, 3, and 6 is just the same. Then the third time I call it with 4, 6, and 8. Like that. Then I remove these ones. So yeah, this is the second example that we're trying. So it will return the first, it will return 140, then undefined and undefined. So if I run this code, let me first run this code, so that you can see it's true. So if I run this code, you can see it returns 140 and undefined and undefined. So that is the solution to this challenge. See you in the next challenge. Peace out.